All right, let's discuss the philosophy of Tyler Durden, Fight Club, and Project Mayhem, this time focusing on the negative attributes. Last video, we had focused on the positive attributes of Durden's philosophy, especially the way in which, through destructive mechanisms, one can detach from inauthentic modes of existence. More specifically, we analyzed the ways in which Tyler Durden was especially fascinated with confronting the realities of one's existence, the lack of any sort of grand purpose or guidance within our life, the pain, the suffering, and most importantly, the inevitability of one's demise through their death, and how confronting those aspects can actually free one or liberate one to live a more authentic existence. So what we're going to do today is focus on potentially the downsides of Durden's philosophy and perhaps the failings of Fight Club and Project Mayhem. So before we turn to the text, let's go on over to the OneNote here. And I think we can see, if we were to look at one of Nietzsche's theories, I think we can have an abstract sense of perhaps one of the primary issues with Tyler Durden. And so this comes from one of Nietzsche's most famous texts, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where he describes the three metamorphoses of the spirit. And he uses figurative images to describe these three different stages of one's metamorphosis towards a more self-actualized and authentic being. And so when we talk about the camel and the lion and the child right here, know that Nietzsche is not saying literally you'll become a camel or a lion or a child. He uses these images in a parable to describe more abstract values. So let's look. In Nietzsche's mind, the step to self-actualization is beginning with the idea of being burdened, all right? You begin as a camel, and you are carrying the weight of values that you did not choose. These could be traditions, these could be parental expectations, these could be norms of others around you, so on and so forth. In Nietzsche's mind, the reason it's a camel is because it's carrying these large weights on its back. It is a beast of burden. And the primary attribute of the camel is that it is obeying a thou shalt command. That's the way he articulates it. So others are telling you you should do X, Y, or Z, and as in the first stage, you obey it. And that's definitely how many of us begin most of our lives. Right now in high school, you are arguably in the camel stage. You are burdened carrying the weight of needing to go to school, get good grades, all the expectations that are placed on you. And we could argue that the narrator is certainly in that stage at the beginning of the novel. He has all the social expectations of how he should act at work and with his boss. He obeys the commandments of consumerism and the society more broadly. He is obedient and submissive. And so overall, the ideas that we've been talking about throughout this unit of him being repressed, him being alienated, I think links very well to this first stage that Nietzsche is talking about in terms of being burdened. Now, Nietzsche says, hopefully at some point, you realize you do not just want to be a camel or you do not just want to be a sheep, that you want to shed these values that have such weight that you did not choose, that are leading to an inauthentic existence where you are just obeying the commandments of somebody else. And hopefully you will get to the second stage, which is that of the lion. Now, what are the primary attributes of a lion? A lion is ferocious, it is powerful, and the lion is capable to battle against these external values and liberate itself from the thou shalt. Right? It no longer needs to obey the commandments. And in Nietzsche's parable, he describes the lion as slaying the dragon scales being all these commands that we implicitly obey early on in our life. And so the way Nietzsche describes it is he says the lion utters a sacred no. Now, here's the issue. The lion sounds pretty good right now, but the issue with the lion is it cannot create new values. It only destroys old ones. And so Nietzsche would say the lion is absolutely essential towards achieving freedom, but it's not the end goal in and of itself. And I think everything we've looked at with Tyler's philosophy, especially in the last lecture, was focusing on these destructive, rebellious, disobedient elements that, yes, lead to a sense of liberation, but the question is liberation to do what? And that's really what I want to explore in this lecture of, is Tyler the end goal, or is he just a step towards liberation, but not the final project in and of itself? And to help give us the framework, this is what Nietzsche says is the final stage, and he says that final stage is the child. It's embodied in the idea of the child. And so look at this quote. He says, "The child is innocence and forgetting, a new beginning, a game of self-propelled wheel, a first movement, a sacred yes. For the game of creation, a sacred yes is needed. The spirit now wills his own will, and he who had been lost to the world now conquers his own world." So hopefully you can see from this quote a lot of key ideas that I don't think would be embodied necessarily in Tyler Durden. Innocence, forgetting, new beginning, a sacred yes. The question is, abstractly, that I want to ask in this lecture is, does Tyler ever actually affirm anything? Is there any positive vision of what he wants the world to be? Or is he purely caught in this more destructive stage? I'm less interested in these three stages as being literally true, and I'm more interested in using them as a framework to approach these questions of whether or not Tyler actually represents a creation of any new value, a creation towards some form of authenticity, or whether or not he is just stuck in this stage of destroying old structures without anything to replace them with. So that's the question that we're going to be asking. And an interesting question to debate, all right, is one, whether you think Tyler actually could perhaps be embodied in this image of the child, whether there is some positive vision that Tyler is embodying, or second, whether the narrator reaches this stage by the end of the novel. Do you think in the final chapters, especially with the way that the narrator is able to overcome Tyler Durden in those final chapters, does he reach a higher stage, or is he just destroyed Tyler and is caught at the second stage without any way to create any new authentic values? Again, the key idea that we've been asking is whether it's possible to live an authentic existence in the modern world, especially the modern world of consumerism. And so far, I think Tyler and Project Mayhem and Fight Club represent a way to destroy the values we don't like, but the question is whether or not there are any new values that Fight Club posits. So, with that, let's go on into the evidence. And we can start with chapter 12. And what I want to do here is take a look at what ends up happening with Fight Club. And I think even early on in the novel, clearly by the end, it becomes clear, because we're following the narrators, the protagonists, that he ends up negating Fight Club, and he ends up realizing that Project Mayhem has gone out of control. But even early on, I think we have some evidence that there are some fishy things going on with Fight Club. And so if we flip to page 96, we can see in this scene, we looked at the end part of this scene, but let's look at an earlier part. On page 96, his boss comes up to the narrator with a sheet of paper with all the rules of Fight Club on it. Let's take a look here. My boss brings a sheet of paper to my desk and asks if I'm looking for something. This paper was left in the copy machine, he says, and begins to read. The first rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club. His eyes go side to side across the paper and he giggles. The second rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club. I hear Tyler's words come out of my boss, Mr. Boss, with his midlife spread and family photo on his desk, and his dreams about early retirement and winters spent at a trailer park hookup in some Arizona desert. My boss with his extra starched shirts and standing appointment for a haircut every Tuesday after lunch. He looks at me and he says, I hope this isn't yours. I am Joe's blood-boiling rage. Tyler asked me to type up the Fight Club rules and make him 10 copies. Not 9, not 11, Tyler says 10. Still, I have the insomnia and can't remember sleeping since 3 nights ago. This must be the original I typed. I made 10 copies and forgot the original. The paparazzi flash of the copy machine in my face, the insomnia distance of everything, a copy of a copy of a copy. You can't touch anything, and nothing can touch you. So notice that the last time we heard the insomnia distance of everything, a copy of a copy of a copy, this was the narrator talking about the dehumanizing experience of both consumerism and his job, where he is replicating a rote formula, where he is just buying stuff that hundreds of thousands of other people already have. And we've done figurative analysis on this before. Copy, or I guess original, could be associated with authenticity. It is the original one, whereas a copy then would be about inauthenticity. It is not the original, it is just mimicking the original. And notice here what's going on is Tyler is actually beginning to franchise Fight Club and beginning to make copies of it in ways that the narrator isn't connected with. So clearly here, it is almost like a company that is expanding. And I think that's why it's so powerful to have this come out of his boss's mouth, is the same techniques that lead to the dehumanizing experience of just being a copy of a copy of a copy within the consumerist world begins to be replicated by Fight Club. If we go to the end of this chapter, page 100, we can see when he runs into Big Bob again, the same experience going on here, right? He runs into Big Bob as he was going to go to the support group, and Bob says, that's the good news. The group's disbanded. I only come down here to tell any guys who might show up. I collapsed with my eyes closed on one of the plaid thrift store couches. The good news, Bob says, is there's a new group, but the first rule about this new group is you aren't supposed to talk about it. Oh. Big Bob says, and the second rule is you're not supposed to talk about it. Oh shit, I open my eyes. The group's called Fight Club, Big Bob says, and it meets every Friday night in a closed garage across town. On Thursday nights, there's another Fight Club that meets at a garage closer by. I don't know either of these places. So notice, again, this is another experience of the narrator realizing that Fight Club is being branched out, that it is being a copy of a copy. And it is that same feeling that you have probably felt if you've ever really liked a band that was really small at some point and you loved them back when they were a no-name band that no one had ever heard of. And then all of a sudden they become super huge and famous and you see everybody walking around with that band on their t-shirt or something like that. But you're like, they don't remember what it was like in the early days with this band. This band is sold out, so on and so forth. The key idea I'm getting at is that there seems to be a loss of authenticity and control. The narrator no longer knows those places because Fight Club, just like everything in his consumerist existence, is beginning to be mass-produced. Let's now go to chapter 16. And if we go to chapter 16, page 125, if you remember, this chapter was all about the creation of Project Mayhem. And it was a chapter that I think very well captures the idea of Project Mayhem and Durden's philosophy being really fascinated with violence and destruction, but not really having a clear end goal. And these are passages that we looked at, but you can see, if we take a look back at them, that what's primarily focused on within Project Mayhem is the idea of destruction. And it says very, very clearly, this is probably a page earlier, it says, it's Project Mayhem that's going to save the world, a cultural ice age, a prematurely induced dark age. Project Mayhem will force humanity to go dormant or into remission long enough for the Earth to recover. If you remember, the goal of Project Mayhem, right here, Project Mayhem will break up civilization so we can make something better out of the world. But notice it doesn't really clarify what that better thing would be. Yes, Tyler has a vision here of just returning to nature, but that seems to be more based on the destruction as opposed to any clear creation. But let's look at the final page, and this on page 100, of what the rules of Project Mayhem are. And throughout this chapter, they've been described in full sentences. Here at the end, they're just given to us in fragments. So it says, don't get any bullets, Tyler told the assault committee. And just so you don't worry about it, yes, you're going to have to kill someone. Arson, assault, mischief, and misinformation. So these are the names of the committees on Project Mayhem. Notice they're all about destruction or negative attributes. And now these are the rules. The first rule of Project Mayhem is no questions. The second rule of Project Mayhem is no questions. The third rule of Project Mayhem is no excuses. The fourth rule of Project Mayhem is no lies. And the fifth rule about Project Mayhem is you have to trust Tyler. Now, what do all those rules get at? All those rules are about blind obedience to authority, and more specifically, authority to Tyler Durden. And we can see here that as Project Mayhem continues to develop, it seems to transform into an almost authoritarian or fascist regime where Tyler is the dictator, no one can question his authority, and everyone has to obey his commandments. Clearly, this doesn't seem to be a path towards liberation, right? Joining a violent anarchist group that is bent on destruction, needing to blindly follow a leader and having rules as part of that group where you cannot ask questions and you have to trust Tyler no matter what, clearly does not seem to be the positive vision of some sort of new or more authentic existence. And we see that really come to a head in the next chapter, chapter 17. And if you go to page 130 here, we can see this with the narrator coming into his house and seeing all the people that have been coming there. And throughout this chapter, Tyler is building an army, so to speak, with more and more people coming into the house. And so let's see. This is page 130. Narrator says, I come home from work now, and the house is filled with strangers that Tyler has accepted, all of them working. The whole first floor turns into a kitchen and a soap factory. The bathroom is never empty. Teams of men disappear for a few days and come home with red rubber bags of thin, watery fat. One night, Tyler comes upstairs to find me hiding in my room and says, don't bother them. They all know what to do. It's part of Project Mayhem. No one guy understands the whole plan, but each guy is trained to do one simple task perfectly. Now, interesting, we've actually heard this phrase before, and you should be asking yourself, where have I heard this phrase of being trained to do one simple task perfectly? Let's keep going. The rule in Project Mayhem is you have to trust Tyler. Then Tyler's gone. Teams of Project Mayhem guys render fat all day. I'm not sleeping. All night I hear other teams mix the lye and cut the bars and bake the bars of soap on cookie sheets, then wrap each bar in tissue and seal it with the Paper Streak Soap Company label. Everyone except me seems to know what to do, and Tyler is never home. I hug the walls, being a mouse trapped in his clockwork of silent men with the energy of trained monkeys, cooking and working and sleeping in teams. Pull a lever, push a button. A team of space monkeys cooks meals all day, and all day teams of space monkeys are eating out of plastic bowls they brought with them. So hopefully at this point, this paragraph was a dead giveaway for that earlier line about no one guy understands the whole plan. Each guy is trained to do one simple task perfectly. Notice this is a throwback to the narrator, and again, almost verbatim, the same language he uses to describe the dehumanizing work that he does under the capitalistic system for his boss, where he just is trained to do one simple task like a space monkey, which is about a loss of control, which is about rote mechanical tasks. And we can see here that now Project Mayhem is replicating that exact same type of work. This isn't the solution that is allowing people to get in touch with their deeper, authentic selves, right? This work, this labor belongs to Tyler Durden in the same way that the narrator's labor at the beginning of the novel belonged to his boss. This work is not self-actualizing, or it is not anything that is challenging or allows one to get in touch with their true selves. It is instead simplistic and basic and at the commands of somebody else. So hopefully, if you're being an astute reader here, you should be scratching your head wondering, wait a second, why is Project Mayhem and Fight Club and Tyler Durden seeming to embody all these attributes that seem to be the problem in the first place? And then, if you, in case you were really missing it, it really brings it to a head in chapter 26, where we finally get a throwback to another thing in the very beginning of the novel. And so this, if we go to page 187, this is when the narrator is beginning or is trying to shut down Project Mayhem, and he gets assaulted by members of Project Mayhem. And let's see what's going on here. They say, "You're a brave man," the bus driver says, "to make yourself a homework assignment." The mechanic tells the bus driver, "Shut up." The lookout doesn't say shit. "You know one of the space monkeys has a rubber band to wrap around your nuts." They fill up in front of the bus. The mechanic says, "You know the drill, Mr. Durden. You said it yourself. You said if anybody ever tries to shut down the club, even you, then we have to get him by the nuts. Gonads, jewels, testes, huevos." And once again, these are lines that we've seen before, but we saw them at the beginning, and we argued that this form of castration is a symbol of emasculation under a system in which people no longer have control over their lives, where they're forced to live inauthentic lives. And we're seeing here that now Project Mayhem is quite literally replicating that aspect of the system that we were critiquing at the very beginning of this novel. It is also, in a quite literal way, trying to castrate the narrator, which is obviously a good symbol of emasculation. So if we go in here, we can see here, if we were to create a chart, we would see that both the system at the beginning of the novel of capitalism and consumerism that seemed to lead to the narrator's deeper problems is perfectly replicated by Project Mayhem by the end of the novel, right? There's a loss of authenticity in both. On the left side, that is because of consumerist objects, which lead to copies of copies of copies. If you remember our discussion around that, right? You think you're so original owning your Nike shoes or your Levi jeans, but really hundreds of thousands, if not millions of other people also have that, whereas in Project Mayhem, everyone becomes the same. Not just in terms of the work that they are doing, but also down to their image itself, right? They all are forced to wear black clothes. They all are forced to shave their head, so on and so forth. Moreover, their identity, they no longer have a name under Project Mayhem, which is something that's described in the Robert Paulson chapter. Next, both the companies under capitalism and the Project Mayhem groups and fight clubs are franchised and mass-produced. Next, there is blind obedience in both systems. On the left-hand side, to your employer and to consumerism. On the right-hand side, to Tyler, the dictator. And both, as we described, lead to a sense of emasculation. Either a loss of control over your life, a loss of authenticity based on those stereotypical masculine traits, or a castration in a very literal way through the space monkeys on the right. What's interesting is Chuck Palahniuk seems to be critiquing both approaches, right? I think on the left-hand side with capitalism, he is showing that there is actually authoritarian or fascist impulses underlying the consumerist system. We are told to obey. We all become copies of copies. We lose any sense of authentic identity. So on and so forth. And also, I think on the right, he is critiquing those revolutionary attempts to overthrow systems. And there are lots of those throughout history, right? Almost every attempt to ignite a genuine revolution against the capitalist system almost always descends into bloodshed. And I think Chuck Palahniuk is getting at a core problem with them, is they often descend into authoritarianism. Look at the French Revolution, noble intentions at first to revolt against the corrupt system of the Ancien regime and make it so that there are equal rights for everybody and more equitably distributed wealth. That ends in bloodshed under Robespierre. Obviously, the communist revolutions of the 20th century are perhaps the most horrific instances of that, where the attempt to overthrow capitalism ends up creating massive or millions of deaths under both Soviet Russia as well as communist China, and many other examples. So the question that we're really left with, guys, I think Palahniuk is too smart to really side with either of these approaches, is whether or not there's any form of solution, all right? We understand that Project Mayhem and Tyler Durden might be problematic. Certainly Project Mayhem, it is clear by the end of the novel, is a failed attempt. It has ended up reproducing all of the same problems that we were experiencing at the beginning of the novel. The only question yet to determine is whether there's a way out. And I think in order to answer this question, we need to look at one final aspect of the novel that we haven't looked at yet, which is the relationship with Marla Singer, which actually at the very beginning of the novel, the narrator says, everything, the explosion, the gun, the anarchy is all about Marla Singer. So Marla, the entire time, has actually been the unspoken center of the text, and we'll have to see if Marla provides a way out.